Stakeholders think that coding is the same as typing. We'll tell designers what to do so developers know how to code.
And that's why I think it's super important for those stakeholders that are listening to realize that, okay, it's not just a linear process. You don't go from point A to point B with design or development. There are bumps in the road.
There's a very relevant problem with stakeholders is identifying the difference between stakeholders and end users. They think they are the end users.
At the end of the day, everything that we're designing, even if we're trying to tie things back to a business outcome or a business, we're still trying to design an experience. I mean, if the experience is bad, people aren't going to use it.
There's overwhelming assumption that it doesn't matter, it's business, right? We're not designing new app for Coke or Nike or whatever. Therefore, why do we need to talk to end users? We just do it and then tell them how to use it. And if you don't talk to them, if you don't talk about real problems, at best, you're going to copy the existing process.
Alex Grinyayev is an advisory UX architect at Delta Airlines, focusing on crew and catering systems. With over 25 years of experience in product design and UX leadership at top companies like GE, Best Buy, and US Bank, Alex specializes in digital transformation, user research, and enterprise solutions. His career spans from webmaster to UX leader, backed by degrees in electrical engineering and interactive media. Join us for our conversation with Alex Grinyayev.
Well, welcome to the podcast, Alex. It's great to have you on. We've been organising this one for a while and really excited for this conversation. So for those that may not know you, I know you've had a lot of experience in UX and worked in a lot of different areas. So give us a bit of a background about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Alex. I've been in the UX field for 25 years, depends on how you count, because I kind of hit the UX field at the time when it was transitioning from the so-called web design. And now it seems like it's transitioning into product design, so it's constantly evolving. I work primarily with the large corporations, the GEs, Best Buy, Deltas of the world, so to speak. About 80% of my time was with big, large companies. When I worked for agencies, my clients were big corporations as well. So it kind of, I'm kind of stuck with them, so to speak. I have a couple degrees, one in electrical engineering and one in media arts or interactive media arts. They changed it recently in my college. I checked and they kind of changed the naming of it. And for the most part, I specialize in discussing and working on new ways of how to build different products. What do you do? How do you solve problems? How do you frame problems before you come in with a solution? So that's kind of that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a great career so far. So I guess you've been around a long time, and as you've discussed, you've kind of seen UX evolve from what was known as web design and a few other different things as well, but involved, I guess now it's more looked at as a much broader discipline, and there's a lot of different things involved. I guess it's been more understood. Things have evolved since it originally became a thing, I think. But how would you say, well, what have you seen evolve over that time period that, you've been in it 25 years? What have you seen evolve in UX?
Yeah, I think when I started, and in my experience, what happened was before it was sort of when I started back in 2000. I graduated in 2000 from Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and it seemed like it was primarily just converting print layouts into web pages. So it's very, very basic explanation, but that's what it was. There was some discussion about flow, some discussion about narrative, some discussion about responsive being, like when you change the screen, what happens, but it was very rudimentary. It was very basic. But as the web design, I guess let's call it this way, as this medium was evolving, I noticed there's a lot of sort of branching out of different specialties. And in my case, I noticed like information architecture. Like how do you deal with information architecture when website was the one of the, again, I call it website. The application, I guess, would be the more appropriate term, but when it was too complex, was too big to just go and create, from scratch, then you go and you start paying attention. How do you connect all these different things? How do you, um, where do you start? Where do you end? Like, how do you branch out, as I mentioned, different scenarios? Then user research, at least, in my experience, not chronologically necessarily, but then I discovered user research, what happened with user research and how it's important to find out where users are coming from. Then now what I see and what I noticed a few years ago, there's product design. So we went from like web design to UX design. Now there's this idea, there's this concept of product design, product designers. So there's a lot of discussions online. What's the difference between product designers and UX designers, or the same? What's the difference between visual designers and UX designers? So you're probably familiar with the famous
Yeah.
illustration, the ketchup bottle, right? The standard glass ketchup versus the upside down, being the UX. So however flawed this explanation is, but that more or less kind of defines the difference between the visual, the graphic design, and the UX design. The product design, seems to me at least, seems like it's the next sort of step, next phase in this evolution, which talks about not necessarily just the visual and experience related issues, but like, where do you start? How do you start? How do you define problems? How do you prioritize them? So it has to do, I think, more with business ideas and like becoming more relevant to the business itself rather than just design aspect of it.
Yeah. I think it definitely can get confusing, I think, for people that probably aren't familiar with it. There's a lot of terms out there and a lot of things that can become, I guess, a bit overwhelming. But really, from my perspective, is user experience design is the heart of it, is probably the way to put it. Of, at the end of the day, everything that we're designing, even if we're trying to tie things back to a business outcome or a business goal or whatever it is, we're still trying to design an experience. I mean, if the experience is bad, people aren't going to use it. If we're designing product, we've still got to design a good experience, right? Even if we're designing something visual, where it may just be essentially a brochure or something like that there. Not that we're getting into that into too much detail, but at the end of the day, I would argue that there's still some level of experience design, right? You've got to look at, okay, how is someone going to be interacting with this? What are they getting out of it, right? What are they using it for? How do we provide the information the easiest way to decipher and that kind of thing? And so to me, it's so important of a process and so important of a discipline to building successful products, and also just maximizing the return for the business, I guess, because if you create the best experience, it sounds pretty obvious, but like, you create the best experience, you're going to get the best results for the business. But a lot of people actually overlook that.
Yeah. And I noticed, it's interesting you mentioned that. I noticed there's a lot of discussion, speaking of the business aspect of design, there's a lot of discussion out there about design thinking for business. You probably heard this. There are multiple books written and YouTube videos and whatnot. There's a lot of material out there. And what I noticed is that there's very little business thinking for designers. So that there's this aspect, at least when I went to school, and that was a long time ago, so maybe it's it's fixed now, so to speak. But very little was given to actually being aligned with business. Like, how do you, like, why as a designer, why are you employed? What are you doing, right? Beside your being just doing, things that you like, how do you contribute to the company? How do you contribute to the bottom line, so to speak? So there's very little of it. There are a few people out there that kind of evangelize from this perspective and explain things, but I think it's still something that needs to be developed further, especially given that there's no universal, well recognized professional organization for user experience or product design. There are a few local ones. There's some are kind of more international, but no one really no one really advocates for designers with businesses.
Yeah, I think there's a few things to that as well, and I'd agree with you. But I think there's a few things to that, and I talk to a range of different people, and some people like are hard against like, no, you can't tie design to business outcomes. You're defeating the purpose of it, and that kind of thing. And others are like, yeah, well, you have to do it. And I am it's of my opinion that essentially you have to tie it to a business outcome for the projects that we do, at least, right? If you're there to make if you're working for a for-profit business and you're there to make a profit, at the end of the day, if you're not driving that, well, then what are you actually doing? Now, there are things that can't be measured. Yes, that is correct. Obviously, it's not that every single thing needs to be measured and that we should be, because there's certain things that can be done that can have an impact that we can't necessarily measure, which is absolutely true. But overall, if our goal and focus is not, okay, we need to, this is our North Star and these are our key objectives or whatever we're focusing on, how we're just wishy-washy. How do we know where we're actually going and what we're trying to achieve for the business? And I think most importantly, what's overlooked here with teams and designers is then how are you proving your value to the company, right? Because then when, things get tight or, things don't go as planned, etc., if you've got no, well, this is exactly what we've brought to the table, this is exactly how we've brought value to the product or the business, then there's no question. But if you're just like, oh, well, we did design, it's like, well, I guess that becomes a bit of a problem, right?
Yep. Yep. I agree with you. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a big thing. I don't know. It seems to be you talk to a range of different people, and some people are like, no, we don't want outcomes tied to design. It's that's just defeating the purpose. You can't measure it, etc. And so I find it very interesting. But I think, to me anyway, for the kind of projects that we're working on and that we do, is that if there's no impact on the business, then we've failed.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a discussion. I on a related note, real quick. There's a lot of discussion, or there's some discussion at least online that I kind of was following lately. How do you, especially now with AI coming in, like how do you stay relevant, right? What do you do as a designer? How do you not fall into this trap of just being a commodity as a designer? Not just like um, making screens, not just pushing pixels, but what value do you bring, right? And from this perspective, what we just talked about before, business thinking for designers, I think that from my perspective, at least, that's the way to go. You gotta start learning what do you do actually.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And a, a lot of designers, if not the majority of designers that I've worked with and or met, to be fair, have not had the level of business understanding that you would expect. And I guess that's somewhat of the problem, contributing to the problem where we're talking about just demonstrating this value. It's like you've got to understand the business and you've got to understand the design. But then your job as a designer, my argument is to tie those two things together, is to say, well, here's what the business wants, here's what those stakeholders want, here's what we need from a product or a design perspective. My job's to bring those things together. And I guess that kind of segues into my next point around misalignment between stakeholders and designers and just the product, right? So,
Yeah.
and you'd have experience with this. Obviously, you've worked with Delta and these other larger companies, etc. But just in general, with these corporations, especially in bigger teams, from my experience, I've seen it, but it also happens in smaller teams, but where you've got stakeholders wanting one thing, and whether or not that's the right thing, that could be argued as well. But at the same time, you've got the design team maybe having another opinion, but then you may even have the end users, which haven't been researched properly, spoken to, etc., that might have something else. So how do you manage that?
And don't forget about IT also. IT wants
Yes.
another thing. Yeah. And then there's legal and compliance. That
Yes.
that yeah. Um, yeah, it's a big problem. It's a big issue, and some places are better in figuring this out than others. In my experience, I always look at stakeholders. Um, what do they say? Like assume the positive intent, I believe it's called, right? So There's the slice, there's a sector in the design community that are feeling negatively about stakeholders. They think that they're kind of cutting down on their creative side, and they're just tell us what needs to be done and we'll do it. But then designers are maybe will be upset that stakeholders not getting it. So I think stakeholders ultimately coming from a completely different perspective. Um, they think, there's someone mentioned online that stakeholders think that um, um, I'm trying to remember exact quote, but it goes something like this: stakeholders think that uh, coding, for example, coding is the same as typing, and stakeholders think that uh, that's how it happens. That's how fast it happens. For example, right? You know what needs to be done. You sit down and you start typing. Therefore, you start coding. That marks the end. Excuse me, the beginning of the process. So although this example is with coders, with developers, software developers, but I think it's true also for designers. So stakeholders don't necessarily know what it takes to go and start. Like you gotta understand the problem first. You gotta understand where this is coming from. So frequently this part is missing on stakeholders' behalf. They come in and there's this approach that's someone on LinkedIn called so the stakeholders will tell designers what to do so developers know how to code. And so you stakeholders coming in saying, here's the problem, here's what we think needs to happen. Can you make a picture of it so developers can go and make it live? And to me, that seems a very flawed approach to begin with, because it creates this silos automatically. There's a lot of handovers that happen. However, stakeholders are doing it, I think, for one reason, just because they don't know how it works. They know, maybe they know there's a problem. They don't know where it's coming from. They come with solutions, potential solutions, from maybe because that's what competitors are doing, and they think we've got to have the same thing. Therefore, we know how to solve it. But competitors may have different problem, and they're it may, the behind the solution may be a completely different thing what they're trying to do. So you got to approach stakeholders, I think, from the perspective of assume positive intent. So they're coming in, they have problems, right? You got to go and you got to start talking to them. The way I been handling it. And this is by no means, it's not a recipe of success. It doesn't work always 100% of the time. But for me, what I figured out is I tend to ask for, first of all, identify who the stakeholders are, what are they doing, what are their roles? Because frequently there's so many of them, right? There's different departments. There's one way to, and they play different roles, and they have different egos, I guess, or different, personalities. So one way to figure this out, you're probably familiar with the RACI matrix. The responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So from this perspective, that's you have a better idea of ultimately who is actually charged with doing things, and who you consult for technical questions or whatever. And informed, that's usually the VPs and managing directors of the world, so to speak. That's one way. Another way, I think Nielsen Norman Group, I think they have managing stakeholders. They look at it from power versus interest, I believe. So there's a quadrant where you got to address stakeholders with a lot of interest and a lot of power, because they ultimately make things happen. So so identification of stakeholders, I think that's the key, right? It might take a few meetings, and it might be a little tricky, because sometimes the loudest person in the room may not be ultimately the person who is making decisions. But that's the way to do it. I think that's the way you go and you start figuring out how to deal with stakeholders.
Yeah, definitely. From my experience on it, stakeholders, you get a range of stakeholders, as you say, right? Some are more informed, some are less informed, some are more pushy, less pushy, more hands-on, less hands-on. But there's just a range of them, and you've got to adapt for different projects. But generally, stakeholders are a lot less informed than we would like, and that's not necessarily their fault. This is not just for design, this is development as well, especially for development. I would even say more than design, because it's even harder to comprehend for a non-technical person what's involved, as you say. And I think with design and development, as you touched on earlier, it's not a linear process. We don't just go from point A to point B and, we're done. And so many of the misunderstandings and problems that we've had on projects have come from that expectation. Simple as that, where it's like, oh, this should be done. This should be done. This should be like this. This should be like this. And it's like, well, it doesn't work that way. Like, we can't just go, oh, here's the problem. And I've seen stakeholders do this, not everyone, but where they go, oh, here's what we need to do, this feature. We need to do this. And it's like a command rather than, okay, this is a suggestion. Let's go and validate it. Let's do the research. Let's actually figure out. It's not talking about we're not talking about an 8-month process, right? We're just saying we need to do some due diligence. We need to work this out. We need to plan it properly. We can't just go, oh, we're just going to add that feature for no reason. Now, if you're a startup with a small team, that's a different story. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about more larger products that are more mature in more mature organizations, where we can't just throw things around and do what we want and throw things at the wall and hope that they stick. And that's why I think it's super important for those stakeholders that are listening to realize that, okay, it's not just a linear process. You don't go from point A to point B with design or development. There are bumps in the road, and there are things that need to be worked out. There are things that need to be researched, developed, clarified, etc. And you need to be understanding of that, and I guess trust your team and work with your team.
One interesting thing you mentioned, linear process. Excuse me. I think it comes from the fact it comes from the, I think, printed world. I think back from those days, because I started as a graphic designer. My original major was animation, believe it or not. Then I switched to graphic design, then to interactive design during college days. And so during print, I didn't really work in the print industry a lot. I did a couple projects my first couple of years, maybe a long time ago, but there's sort of linearity when you do print, because print is not reversible. You gotta have you gotta know what needs to be done. You do a press check. You make sure before it goes into press, right before they don't print anything. They shouldn't. You check colors, you check spelling, you check everything, and then it's done, and then it goes into production. With the digital world, it's a completely different approach, but I think the mentality is still there. And like, speaking of linear process, I noticed some of the stakeholders are asking, show me final wireframes, show me final prototype. And I noticed on many occasions, I say, it's never final. Really, like, we just got to draw. We got to agree that this, the current state of the prototype, for example, it defines a solution for a given problem, and that's what we're going to go with for MVP, let's say, for phase 1, whatever you call it. And then you go with it. And for some people, and I don't want to say older people, because I'm 52 myself, but for some people, it's hard to understand this concept that there's no more box that like you used to, like, if you experienced this before. There used to be, you buy software, you buy it in the box, and it comes on a CD or on 3-inch floppy or 3.5-inch floppy disks, if you remember that time. So it comes, and you have to, right? It comes on the box. It's done. And then you have to go and buy updates or upgrades, years or a year later. So in the current world, it's not a linear process. It's constant. As a team with stakeholders included, you got to agree. That's what we go into. That's what we're going to do. Given, yes, there's a backlog and it's going to get better, but we're going to do this. There's no such thing as final wireframes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's not it's not about jumping to conclusions, right? That's the biggest thing with stakeholders is like, we don't want to just assume we know what we need to do. And like you said earlier about copying a competitor, or we've had this where a lot of teams come in and they can say, oh, we know what our customers want and we know we need to do this and we know we need to do that. And they're very sure of it. But when you start pushing and saying, okay, what evidence have you got for that? Or, where have you got that from? Have you spoken with customers? When's the last time you actually did research? Oh yeah, I spoke to someone on the phone a few times or whatever. Or there's no actual evidence and it's gut feel. Now, there's nothing wrong with that feeling. The people have developed this intuition, they've developed this knowledge over a long period of time, especially the projects that we work on. So it's not to say it's all wrong. It's just about the fact that that is not a guaranteed slam dunk of like, okay, this is going to make us a successful product. And what people do typically, and I'm talking about more where people are building customer portals or they're building applications for orders or warranty, whatever it is for in our kind of area. It might be a little bit different in your space, but whether it's a B2B application, an internal operations application, whatever it is, they've got this idea that, we know exactly what we need to build. We'll go and build it and then we'll release it and it'll be fine. That's the quickest way for us to do it. They release it and what happens? It's like no one uses it. It's terrible. It's not what people wanted. And then they wonder why, they haven't got the results that they need or haven't got the results that they wanted. And a lot of it, the majority of it, in my opinion, comes back to UX design, which is we haven't done the research, we haven't done the wireframing, we haven't done the testing, we haven't understood the problem properly, we haven't got clear on what we need to do. Therefore, it's kind of, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to mention because I think it's there's very relevant problem with stakeholders is identifying the difference between stakeholders and end users. Something I noticed on many occasions that in some places there's no distinction between when you talk to stakeholders, for example, they think they are the end users. And in some cases, it happens, but although in my experience, rarely. But usually, it's let's say there's a problem. Let's say a certain department making a lot of errors, like during their process, and a head of this department, who's been with the company for many years, for example, is reaching out to designers and saying, "Hey, we need to come up with something else. We need to do something new because we have a lot of errors." And when you start asking questions and you say, well, can we go actually and talk to people who are going to be using this on a daily, weekly, whatever, on a regular basis? And then a stakeholder, this manager will say, I work for a company for 20 years. I know everything. Ask me. And I noticed that they very frequently, they don't have the same insights as end users. So someone mentioned on LinkedIn, I believe, there's this phrase, there's no such thing as stakeholder-centered design. There's user-centered design, right? There's no stakeholder-centered design. So, but as far as kind of setting the expectations from stakeholders, I think kind of helping them realize that absolutely, we value your feedback, right? And yes, you do want problem to be solved, but is it possible that you're biased? Right, it's possible that you think but it's because you don't do it on a daily basis. Therefore, you can provide really valuable insights from this perspective. Valuable, obviously, a lot of insights from the business perspective, from what we're trying to solve. But it's not you're not the end user, right? And it's just that's the problem, and that leads frequently. What you mentioned is that you work on something, and then you realize that nobody's adoption rate is very low. Well, because you didn't ask the end users, because you didn't consider what they, what they're thinking, how they use it, the context of it.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of that is where, as you say, stakeholders have been in the business for, say, 20 years, some of them. And I think a lot of it is, I know what the end user wants, and it's somewhat stuck in their ways to a degree where it's like, they still bring that thinking. Not everyone, this isn't everyone, but there is a lot of them where it's like that thinking's brought and it's like, no, you need a fresh perspective. You need someone from outside to say, well, have you thought about it like this? And a lot of the time, like, oh, no, we haven't, right? Or they haven't even talked to the customers, for example, and yeah, it's just super important to not, I guess, just assume that we know the answers, right? We've got to do that research. I think something that you mentioned as well is like problem framing before we design the solution, right? We need to know what the problem is before we go and try and come up with this solution. And I think a lot of the problems is the assumption that we know the problem. Now, we might know the business problem, but we might not be looking at it in the right way or the right perspective to go, okay, well, actually, the root cause is X. And if we can solve that in a different way, then we're going to get the problem, right? Going to solve
Yeah,
it.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I believe it was a Honda or Toyota founder that came up with the rule of five. I believe it's called. You ask why five times, so to go and get to the root of the problem. So you don't pursue the knee-jerk reaction, so to speak. But you ask, why this happened and why. So five times, I believe that's the magic number. Um, so I try to, and again, it doesn't always work, right? It depends. Every situation is different for every company, every project. But I try to, when I talk to stakeholders, I try to explain, kind of lay out the plan. Like, let's say we talk with stakeholders, we as designers, right? Myself as a designer. I talk to you guys about the business problem. What needs to happen? Like, who's responsible first? The whole racing metrics. Then, what are the business goals? What are you trying to figure out? Like, what are you expecting from this? Cut time, reduce number of errors. Ultimately, all comes down to money, one way or another. Speaking of business thinking for designers, right? So ultimately, it all relates to money in one way or another, either by reducing the time it takes or removing obstacles or whatever the thing is. And one thing I also noticed that helps is, and I believe it comes from a uh, psychology concept of like who do you what exactly you don't want to do. Right. So this aspect of the future product. I notice in many cases, if you ask them specifically what you don't want to do, it leads to a lot of discovery. It leads to a lot of interesting things, threads that you can pull and find out more. Speaking of asking why five times. But this is sort of a stakeholder part, and then I tell them I got to go talk to end users also, and because I'm curious what sort of problems they have. I'm curious what are they going through. And so you go through this, you're figuring out the user journey, right? You go through this process and figuring out, what works, what doesn't, end users sometimes may have very simple, very elegant solutions that they think of, right? Because if they deal with certain issues on a daily basis, it just forces you to come up with something, right? And so you may have a solution right there. You may have very excellent insights. And then you gather all this information, you synthesize it, right, and present it in a great format, in a digestible format, and you show it to stakeholders, right? So you gotta alternate stakeholders and users, and hopefully then you can agree with stakeholders, with end users contributing greatly to what needs to be done. Then you show this is what we're going to be working on. I think in our common understanding, that's the problem, right? We didn't even get to the solution yet, right? That's the problem that we're trying to solve based on our asking different end users and what we talked with stakeholders before. And I think in many cases that leads to actually, I see kind of realization, and like, oh yeah, now that you mention it, yeah, that's, we don't want to go there. We want to do this, right? So there's frequently, not always, frequently, there's a good feedback that comes out of it. But getting buy-in into this process, that's the different problem.
Yeah, I agree. And just talking about getting buy-in, my advice for anyone listening would be you've got to get the stakeholders on board to begin with. And by doing that, we've got to tie our work back to business outcomes and prove that there's a business case. Now, this is the point. If we're working on something that doesn't have a business case, there's no point working on it, right? If you're in for profit and you're trying to do something that doesn't have a business case and an upside for the business in regards to the bottom line, then at the end of the day, you're constantly going to be fighting stakeholders, constantly going to be fighting the project. So for your own benefit, for everyone's benefit, that's the biggest, most important thing. And I don't think that's just a design team's responsibility. I think that's a team in general. But okay, how do we look at this and we run conservative numbers, whatever pillars that we're looking at, and we demonstrate that if we can achieve X, Y, and Z, it's going to have this impact on the business, and this is conservative. If you get that buy-in from stakeholders from the beginning, you're going to have support the whole way through. Where the problem lies is the fact that they feel that there's no value in this, which means that they're like, it's wasting my time. We're not going to get any results out of it anyway. Why are we even bothering with it? So therefore, you're constantly fighting it. On the flip side, if you've got that buy-in where it's like from the beginning, they have contributed to it, you've mapped out this business case, they've said, yeah, that's totally conservative. It is definitely achievable. It's not unrealistic. And yeah, we support what you're doing, then suddenly it's a completely different story.
Yeah, it's I call it figuring out some people call it low-hanging fruit, which I prefer low effort, high impact terminology. That's because it talks about impact, actual business impact. So low-hanging fruit sort of kind of has this negative connotation, right? Like nobody wants it, but figuring out and going through this process of figuring out goals, anti-goals, talking to end users, presenting another side of the story. It helps ultimately to come with the realization at the end that we're going to do this low effort. It's not going to take a long time, well, relatively speaking, but it's going to produce big effort. Well, big impact. Excuse me. It's going to take little effort and it's going to produce big impact. And that, from my experience, that works great because then you see, right, stakeholders coming from the business background. Again, that's how they think. It's like, yeah, it's going to take us, I don't know, 2 months or something, 6 months, whatever, depending on the complexity and scale. And yeah, we're going to see this sort of improvements, especially if you capture it. Like it's, I think there's a lost art of writing hypothesis, right? That's what we observed and what we're going to do, and we expect this to happen, and we know that this is true, that it's going to lead to, I don't know, 50% in sales increase or something like that. The one thing I wanted to mention real quick, about involving end users in the beginning of the process, because I noticed it helps with onboarding later. Because if you're dealing with a group, like in my experience, I usually do internal B2B applications. And when you go and you talk to end users, you pick, let's say, 5 people, and you go through building journeys with them and things like that. And you ask all those questions, you tell them we're building this solution that we're going to help you a lot. So they go back and they talk with their peers, right? So there's excitement building. And then at the end of the process, before you start development, when you go and when you do usability testing for prototype, they're already kind of psyched, right? They're interested in it. So again, bringing, we talk about stakeholders and figuring out problem. Absolutely. At the same time, when you bring end users and you start treating them not as, here's something, I'm going to slap together, you got to use it or else, right? You ask them questions, you treat them as, valuable contributors, and at the end, it will come back and it will improve your adoption.
Yeah. It's great advice. Definitely great advice. And getting that early buy-in, not just from the decision makers and stakeholders, but also those end users is really good, and it gives you the ability to get them involved in it, and they feel like they're not being forced to do it, but rather involved in the process. It's been a really, really good chat, and I've really appreciated it, Alex. I think we shared a lot of good insight. So, you got any closing thoughts or anything else you'd like to add?
One probably biggest one is it takes time. It takes months, it takes years, so it's a long term, going and fixing things. And like I heard someone, Teresa Torres, I believe, that's her phrase, is meet other people where they're at. So when you go and when you try to introduce all these different ways of solving problems, so figuring out problems first, and then coming up with solutions, right, which seems counterintuitive for many in the business world. You got to meet them where they're at. You got to understand that that's what they've been doing, and changing is difficult for them, and it takes months and takes years, and you got to keep track of it, and you got to show that yes, we did this and this, and we spent that much time, and that's the result. So you got to keep track of it, be cognizant, and start um, practicing business thinking for designers.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I do have 3 final questions I asked every guest, so I'd love to jump into those now and get your thoughts on those. The first one is, what's one thing you believe businesses are not paying enough attention to right now that will be critical in the next 5 years?
Say it again. I'm sorry.
What's one thing you believe businesses are not paying enough attention to right now that will be critical in the next 5 years?
I know one thing that business is paying too much attention. That's AI right now, but not paying enough. I think including end users, like especially in my world, where majority of products I've done are B2B products, and there's overwhelming assumption that it doesn't matter. It's business, right? We're not designing new app for Coke or Nike or whatever. Therefore, why do we need to talk to end users? We just do it and then tell them how to use it. Training, right, comes up a lot. Like, oh, we're gonna solve it with training. And guess what? End users are using Excels and Outlooks and whatever, right? And you're trying to come up with this new solution. And if at best, if you don't talk to them, if you don't talk about real problems, at best you're gonna copy the existing process that is using Excel and Outlook, so to speak. And then end users are going to say, "Why would I use it? Because it's a new thing. I want to learn. I need to learn. Excuse me. I know Excel and I know Outlook and it works. Why would I use it? Right? Because you didn't go and you didn't ask them. You didn't find out what's missing, what they cannot do. You don't know what they cannot do with Excel. What are the limitations of Outlook? And I think that's the thing that businesses need to realize, I think, and just talk to your employees, talk about this kind of things, because I think that's going to solve a lot of problems.
Very good. Very good. The second one is, what legacy do you want to leave in your industry? How do you hope your work will influence or shape the future?
Legacy. I don't think about my work as legacy, but I think as far as legacy, I just make things a little more sane, I guess, a little more like it's not just drop everything and go and rush and do things, right? Just like ask why, right? We talked about problem, identifying a problem, right? That's asking the question why. Why are you doing this? Someone said that he who knows why can deal with almost any how. I think that's what that sounds like. But so why is not asked a lot. There's questions when, there's questions how much, there's question how, but very few people ask questions why, and I think that's very important. And I hope that's going to be my legacy, that people started asking question why more than that they do now.
Very good. And the final one is, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self at the start of your career?
Oh, that's a good one. Recently, I just on LinkedIn, I actually did this post where I mentioned I wish I would have known before how to design my own life. Because we talked about asking, what is the problem, asking questions why, and things of that nature. And I realized a few years ago that I very frequently, and I don't think it's just me, I think it's in general, we tend to prioritize urgency over importance, and we don't ask why. We just run with it, right? Because someone else is doing it, because that's the expectations of society from us, or expectations that your family expects, or whatever the reason is. We do not design our own lives in a way, right? We don't think of it as um, a process that you actually have control over it, right? So if you need to figure out, why are you doing certain things before you start actually figuring out how you do this, right? And I believe I wish I would have realized that a while ago, because that's going to save a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of um, um, just is going to make it easier and more meaningful.
Very, very interesting. Well, I appreciate your time, Alex. It's been a good chat, and
Thank you.
thanks once again. And to anyone listening, we've got a lot of other great episodes as well on our YouTube channel, Spotify, Deezer, anywhere else where you find your podcasts. Subscribe, share it, and let us know if you've got any suggestions of how we can improve, or any other guests as well. And really appreciate you listening. So thanks once again, Alex.
Thank you.